Good evening, everyone. I know it's late, so thank you very much for being here. Dear colleagues, dear friends, it's a real pleasure to welcome you today at the Graduate Institute, the Geneva Graduate Institute, for the 2022 public event of the GESDA Summit. The Institute has been exploring technologies since its inception because of the prominent role that technologies play in international relations, and particularly the strong link between technological innovation, security, and power. Tonight, we are exploring new frontiers, technological, biological, but also political, social, economic, geopolitical, social, and environmental frontiers. In an unpredictable geopolitical context, with a convergence of major challenges, the temptation to consider technology as a solution is strong. Advances in synthetic biology and genetic engineering can lead to a fast-growing number of purposes, such as biofuels, new drugs, replacement organs, but also biological threats. Agency, individual and collective, are crucial to guide technological development and inspire anticipation exercises. Science, and particularly social science, is also essential to guide technological development and inspire anticipation exercises. What have we learned from recent technological developments? I'm thinking, for instance, of social media platforms. First, that designing technologies without consultation with a diversity of stakeholders has contributed to reinforcing existing social discriminations that could probably have been avoided if a wider range of stakeholders, in particular the most affected, the most vulnerable and marginalized, for example, women, were included in the design of such technologies. Any technology is indeed eminently political. It is the result of choices, of power relations in a specific context at a specific time, and is obviously not neutral. It conditions social uses just as uses condition or shape technology. Second, the pace of technological innovation is different from the pace of their social, environmental, and political and economic impact. Waves of technological development occur rapidly, while their impact can span decades, making them very difficult to predict. This leads me to express a wish, which is in line with our vision of technology at the Institute, to include in the design and development of technologies the values and principles that are at the heart of international Geneva, such as principles of international humanitarian law, human rights, the principles of peace and sustainability, the participation of civil society, or what our director Marie-Laure Salle refers to as good in tech. Given the role that technology is playing in our everyday lives and on the international stage, when examining technology, we should also examine questions of agency. When considering the future, we should also consider the agency. How do we see the future? Here as well, the temptation to conceive the future as a fixed notion, something material, maybe a technology, something out there, outside of us, is strong. But the future is in here. The future is a human capacity and a quality, a projection of human consciousness and culture. To quote the French futurist Gaston Berger, the purpose of looking at the future is to disturb the present. With the considerable challenges that lie ahead, we must not only create opportunities for collective exploration and understanding, but also for the deployment of new visions, constructive solutions, and propositions for desirable, sustainable, inclusive, and plural futures. Our event tonight, our discussions, as well as science, and in particular social science, should nourish these visions and proposals for the future, which in turn must guide the development of current and future technologies. Thank you for your attention and welcome.
I'm your moderator for the evening. I am the founder of a media company called Neolife, where we publish a weekly newsletter and a website covering what we call the neobiological frontier, which is the next stage of what we called 30 years ago now, the digital revolution. And as we turn our digital tools and maker mindset to engineering our own biology, we anticipate the same kind of disruption and extraordinary transformation that the digital revolution has brought. So we'll talk a lot about that tonight. Prior to that, I helped build a chocolate factory and ran it on the waterfront in San Francisco. I know, sounds a little random. But perhaps I'm best known as the co-founder of Wired magazine, literally 30 years ago next year. I'm also the board chair of the Human Immunome Project, which is a newly launched nonprofit initiative to understand and build a quantitative, predictive model of the human immune system in all its extraordinary complexity. You can hear more about that tomorrow morning if you are participating in the GESDA Summit, either in person or online, at 8:30 in the morning. So just as an aside, I'm thrilled to be back in Geneva. I was here last year for the GESDA Summit, but I was here a very long time ago in the 80s, and I learned how to hang glide off of the Salève. And I actually, before that, did a degree in international affairs. So coming back here feels like coming home and kind of making my whole life make sense, which otherwise it doesn't necessarily. So this is being filmed and live stream. It will be online at some point. And so this evening, thank you for that wonderful introductory video. We have somebody here who will provoke and inspire you, I feel sure. We'll hear from Andrew Hessel first, who will give a keynote. Then we have 3 extraordinary panelists who are going to join us, at which point the 5 of us will have a little conversation. And then we will open it up to the audience here in the auditorium and those of you who are streaming it from home for questions. And so we hope that as you are listening to the various speakers and conversations, you'll be thinking about ways you want to participate in the conversation. So please send us your questions as soon as you think of them. So you're all familiar, I suppose, with the concept of the Anthropocene. It's an idea, it's a suggestion that we have perhaps left the phase of the Holocene and entered into a new geological phase as of roughly the 1950s or so, one where we humans are the primary driver of impact on the geology and the ecosystems of our planet. So geoscientists actually met in May of this year to consider where to place the golden spike. So the golden spike is basically a core drilling that will be placed somewhere around the world, only one place, where the scientists will pull the core sample out and analyze it for human impacts. So the types of impacts they're looking for are like heavy metals or ash or light carbon. They're looking for evidence of algal blooms, which of course would be caused by global warming. Minerals from mining, radioisotopes from nuclear explosions, etc. All of these would be evidence of the human impact. But we, regardless of what the geologists decide, we have certainly entered a new phase as a species. And it's one in which our tools are now so powerful and our impact is potentially so great that we could literally destroy Homo sapiens as we know them along with the planet. So there have been many threats, existential threats along the way. So this is not anything new at the Institute of Graduate Studies, right? So we have climate change, we have nuclear weapons. More recently, we have the concept of an AI that runs amok, or robots, taking over and enslaving humans, or using us as batteries, as the film Matrix portrayed. And of course, there's biological weapons. But in spite of possessing nuclear capabilities for over 70 years, we have yet to blow ourselves up. And so our guests tonight will discuss the possibility that these new godlike, powerful synthetic biology tools can also be contained and can be developed and harnessed for tremendous benefit to humanity. I figured I had to get that out there because everything else they're going to talk about is really scary. And I just want to not lose sight of the fact that there are tremendous opportunities with these technologies. As the video points out, and as Andrew will point out, we can potentially reverse climate change. We can harness things like carbon, which people could think of as, we're choking on it and it's the cause of so many of our problems. We can turn that into industrial fish feed. We can turn it into new materials. We can turn it into textiles and building materials. We can harness bacteria and viruses to cure human diseases. We can hack our immune system. We can create living simulations of human tissues, transform agriculture to use less land, less water, less harmful chemicals. We can bring back lost species. We can rewild our landscapes, and we can put ourselves back in alignment with the forces of nature. But none of this can happen unless we figure out how to organize ourselves to maximize the opportunities and minimize the substantial risks. So, I'm going to give you introductions, and then I will let Andrew take it off. I'm going to start by saying it's my extraordinary honor and pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Andrew Hessel. Andrew's trained initially as a microbiologist. He studied bacterial genomics, and he ended up in pharma, but that's really just the beginning of Andrew's story. He left his native Canada for California, where he served as co-chair of biotechnology and bioinformatics at Singularity University. And then he became a distinguished researcher at Autodesk. Two very innovative and kind of provocative West Coast organizations. He likes all things living with a special affinity for E. coli and viruses of all kinds, except maybe not SARS-CoV-2. He's also the co-founder of Human Genomics, which is a company that uses a digital-first approach to design therapeutics. and it's basically a platform for making artificial viruses which can be used to develop new cancer drugs. More recently, he founded the Genome Right Project, whose aim is to push the boundaries of what we can do with DNA. So we learned how to read it when we sequenced the human genome back in 2003 or 4, whatever you want to say. We learned how to edit it with tools like CRISPR, which won the Nobel Prize back in 2022 in chemistry. But now Andrew is leading an effort to write with DNA, synthesizing genomes from scratch using our powerful new godlike tools. So Andrew lives way out on the bleeding edge, as you can tell. His new book, which he co-wrote with author Amy Webb, is called The Genesis Machine, Our Quest to Rewrite Life in the Age of Synthetic Biology. It includes 9 risks and 5 scenarios of life inexorably altered by our biotechnologies, and I encourage you all to read it. It's very accessible, and it gives you a high-level and thorough and thought-provoking read. We also have with us tonight Sir Professor Peter Gluckman, who really embodies the concept of science and diplomacy. He's got many degrees, many honors, and many titles. The current ones are President of the International Science Council in New Zealand and Paris. He's head of COI2, the Center for Informed Futures at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Before that, he was the first chief science advisor to various prime ministers of New Zealand and also to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Originally trained as a pediatrician, he's published over 700 scientific papers from evolutionary biology to neurobiology and developmental biology and more. He's got half a dozen books, both technical and for the general public, including Ingenious: The Unintended Consequences of Human Innovation. We also have with us Aranches Gonzalez-Laya, who is currently, also has many titles and honors and affiliations, but she is currently the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po. Originally trained as a lawyer, she served her native country of Spain in many roles, including most recently as the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the European Union and Cooperation. She was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and the Executive Director of the International Trade Center. And she has negotiated many trade agreements, and we are looking to her for some trade and economic impacts of these technologies. And finally, we have Professor Timothy Swanson, which those of you who are here at the Institute will know. And he is the Professor of International Economics. He's Chair of Environmental Economics and Academic Co-Director of the Center for Environmental Studies at the Graduate Institute. He's lectured at University College London, Cambridge, and served as the research director for the UK's National Centre on Social and Economic Research on the Global Environment. I'm very excited to talk to him about his environmental governance in China interest, his biodiversity management, both domestically and globally, water management, et cetera, but particularly intellectual property rights and biotechnology regulation. So that's it. That's who you've got tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to kick us off.
It is an absolute pleasure to be here. I am many things, but a lot of what I am is a troublemaker, because I just enjoy speaking about these life technologies to anyone that will listen. Kids, seniors, everyone in between, because really the only thing that we all have in common is life. It's the only thing. And yet, it's the thing we think about the least. This is the book cover, just so you have a visual image when you're going past your next bookshop. And I can tell you, it's a book about science, but it's not a book for scientists. It's a book for everyone to read and get some grounding in this technology called synthetic biology, which is still very much below the radar. Most people haven't heard of it. Most people, 9 out of 10, have never heard the term. And if you ask them, what is synthetic biology, you'll get essentially no reasonable answer. Even the scientists have not agreed on what it is, only that it makes biology easier to engineer. It's a functional definition. I'm always completely stunned by what an amazing species we are and how unique we are. We're the only species that doesn't live in nature. We build our environments around us. Our technology supports us, our engineering supports us, and it is a fast-changing world. It has changed so much in the last century. It's hard to even imagine. We've gone from an agrarian society to having cities like Hong Kong that are international, fast-paced, and our evolution of our technologies, cities, environments is only accelerating. And there's this one technology that we just forget about, called life. This is actually a computer-generated image from DALL-E 2. I just said, show me a cup of coffee with the words life written in foam, and it produced this image. So artificial intelligence is starting to get really creative. But life was the first technology. It is a technology that makes us. We didn't make it. So it's really unfamiliar to us. In fact, it's the only technology that really butts heads with religion. No one thinks their cell phone was made by a god. Life is so universal, ubiquitous, everywhere. The deepest hole we drill, bacterial colonies thrive in clouds. It is surrounding us everywhere. It's on every surface. It's in every breath we take. It's in our bodies. It makes our bodies. We are completely blind to it, like the air we breathe, and the fact that we're breathing. The only time we really notice it is when we're creating a new life. I don't get to share in that role, really, all that much. I have 2 children. I was totally fascinated by the process, in part because they started off in labs. They're both IVF babies. I spent more time in the lab than most dads. We also notice it mainly when it starts to fail, when we get sick, when our friends and family get sick, or they die. It's just because it's so reliable and so robust. We're blind to it. And all life is built on this incredible technology, this building block that we call the cell. These are cell phones. We're more familiar with those today, but you can sometimes make a man out of them. This is artist Lou Boland from a brilliant TED Talk he gave a few years back. The cell is my favorite machine. It's the only machine I really want to study anymore because it's mysterious. It's the Lego brick of all living things. And plant, animal, or microbe, the machinery inside the cell, the low-level machinery, is conserved. It's absolutely universal. These are human cells, time-lapse, growing in a dish. Not ones that I've grown, it's just stock footage. But the cell is a factory. It is a factory that makes thousands of different products that all come together and are built at the same time. And the most amazing thing about this factory is it can build more factories. No human technology can do that. At Autodesk, a design company, we worked very closely with companies that made 3D printers. 3D printing is a really interesting technology, but most can only print a single material. These are multi-material 3D printers that can make more 3D printers. This is the E. coli bacterium, same thing, stock image. The beautiful thing about this little machine, this factory, is that it's been around for almost 4 billion years, way older than us. Our bodies are actually designed to be farmers of this little organism. They grow in your guts and help digest your food and absorb it so that we can live. Under ideal conditions, they'll reproduce every 20 minutes. So one bacterium will grow to over 50 billion bacteria in 12 hours. I love this organism. Seriously. I love comparing cell phones with cells because although very different mediums, they actually have very similar architectures. Both are systems of systems. And with cell phones, we started at the bottom. and built up. We built the components. We started to put them together to make circuits. We made more complex circuits. We made networks, etc. With biology, with the cell, we started with the thing, the object, the organism, and we've spent literally all of our time taking it apart, first classifying them, and then starting to dissect them. And today we do that molecular dissection all the way down to the single proteins and other components within the cell. It's been a journey of exploration that you don't need rockets for. You can do it really from just about anywhere. We are the gods of small things. We just don't understand how they work. This is the genome of an E. coli. It's a classic image. It's like you stepped on the organism and just squished it open. That's the molecular thread of DNA, and it encodes about 4,500,000 bits of information. To give you an idea of how much information that is, it's one photo on your phone. And yet that's enough information to build an organism that has persisted for billions of years. And today I'm really old school, but when I first saw that picture, I just saw a magnetic tape, because that's how we recorded digital information and stored it in my first computers. And we still do it for backups today. Today we have microscopes that can allow us to directly visualize the double helix. This is from the lab of Dr. Alice Payne. I love these images. We can even read the sequence of that code in the helix if we chose to, but it's not the most efficient way of doing it. This is biotechnology really dumbed down, because I speak to a lot of kids, and this is really this is the meat and potatoes of biotech. If you have a segment of DNA that encodes something you want, something that's useful, and you can put it into a bacterial cell or other cell, or even a cell-free system where you just break cells open and put the components in a tube, those components or cells will use the instructions in DNA to make biological products, whatever you've designed in that code. It could be a protein for a food. It could be a high-energy molecule like a fuel. It could be a medicine. It could be a structural material. It could be the whole organism edited or engineered. We don't know the limits of this. It's so universal because there's only one programming language for all living things, unlike our computer systems, which are very fragmented and very diverse systems. And the take-home message that I try and deliver to everyone is if you can write DNA, if you can read it and write it, because it's a programming language, you can engineer anything biological. Anything. Any living thing that has ever existed on this planet uses this programming language, and every component thereof. So it's a really, really powerful language. And we've done that engineering in labs. And labs haven't really changed much in the last 100 years. This is circa 1900. Today, a more modern lab looks like this, but they're basically just complicated kitchens. And for the most part, the people working in those kitchens were doing manual processes. When I started off, if you could sequence a few hundred base pairs of DNA code and say anything useful about it, you got a PhD. Today, in just a few hours, you can sequence a human genome sitting at a bench like this using equipment. The manual processes are being changed. They're being digitized, and it's because really the manual processes, you had to manipulate the actual molecule of DNA. We used molecular scissors and molecular glue to stitch things together to write new code. That just doesn't scale. I actually sat down with magazines and scissors and glue and wrote out this quote from a synthetic biologist. It took me an hour and 20 minutes. It looks Frankenstein-ish. It's scary. We used to have ransom notes written like this. Today, just like the film industry, just like the music industry, genetic engineering has been digitized. Oh, did you want to get that photo, Bruno? I love this quote. Synthetic biology is just the intersection of our growing knowledge of life science combined with this foundation of computing that we've built really over the last 50 or 60 years, intersecting now with automation, essentially just robots. Put computation and life science together, you get bioinformatics or systems biology. That's where I started my biological career. Take life science and automation and put it together, and you get machines sitting on desks that are much more powerful and reliable than most people. Put computation and automation together, and you get the amazing world of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And when those three intersect, we get this incredible new technology that gives us the ability to digitally and physically manipulate life with very powerful tools. Today, the reading of DNA, something that was seeded in 1990 seriously with the Human Genome Project, is an automated process. A few technicians can run armies of sequencers with all the information flowing into computer systems. The software tools for designing and editing DNA are getting more and more powerful. They run on your laptop, they're not that tough. And the artificial intelligence now that's being applied to this software is giving us new capabilities that we're just starting to explore. Because in the same way that I made that cup of coffee image, you can now say, design me a protein that has certain features, and the artificial intelligence will try and do that. Instead of manipulating the DNA molecule physically, we have printers for it now, or services that do it. This is a desktop printer made by a French company that prints out DNA, but many of these services here will print out as much DNA as you send them in a file, and it'll be shipped to you in a day or two. Genetic engineering used to be something that really required years of training, specialized facilities, reagents that were very hard to come by. Today, it's something I can teach a 7-year-old, at least the very basics. Oops. Sorry, that video didn't run properly, but the labs themselves are becoming automated. So you don't need those physical laboratories. Oh, did that run? I started working with cloud labs over a decade ago. And these are programmable laboratories. So now you have a whole digital path from design, compilation of genetic code, to ultimately the manipulations that would normally have to be done manually, all using a programmable facility. It's essentially a closed loop. And those technologies are coming to chips. At the very forefront are chips like this. This is the first molecular electronic chip. It was published earlier this year. It took 6 years to develop. This is the same chip that might be in a computer or a cell phone, but now you can attach biomolecules to it. This has 16,000 biotransistors, so to speak. It's the equivalent of the first computer processors that were developed in the early 1970s. So, an incredible new technology that's just starting to appear. And this is the game changer, because when you can make a chip, it suddenly costs just a few dollars to make incredibly powerful technology. So life is becoming more and more programmable. People argue whether it's programming or not. It doesn't matter to me. We can now engineer life using digital tools. And because it rests on a digital foundation, it does everything we know digital technologies do. They get faster, better, cheaper, smaller, everywhere. My fridge is Wi-Fi connected today. It's allowing small groups of people, even individuals with the right tools, to do genetic engineering, to do biotechnology. We can make nucleic acids to reprogram cells. We can make virtually any protein. Google's DeepMind division just solved the structure computationally of every protein ever published. And this is now going to move into a design phase. We've started to engineer small organisms like viruses. The first virus was made from scratch 20 years ago. This is not new. It's something that's been happening for a while, but now the field is starting to accelerate. And just so you understand how I think about viruses, because I have a company that makes them, they're just USB sticks. Without a cell to plug into, a computer to plug into, they're completely inert. Some of these viruses are harmful to us. The vast majority of them are harmless. But as we start engineering them, they could be far deadlier than anything nature has ever produced. Nature cannot make highly infectious, highly pathogenic viruses. It kills all the computers that they would run on. That's no blockage for us. 12 years ago, this man, Dr. Craig Venter and his team, synthesized the first bacterial genome. This is ancient history in digital times. But most people aren't aware that this has even been done. This is work that I don't even think is properly recognized because it closed a 4 billion year cycle of evolution from the first cell naturally appearing in our primordial oceans or wherever to evolving an organism that understands enough of biotechnology to go and synthesize a new bacteria. That's pretty remarkable. So if you're on the Nobel Committee, please, please, please recognize this work. It's absolutely the foundation of synthetic life. Already we've been climbing up. Now that we know we can make synthetic cells, there are other people that are climbing up the tree of life, following in this path. 3 years ago, the E. coli bacterium that I love so much was synthesized from scratch. There's now a company that's built around that technology that's just going to be creating a Cambrian explosion of new bacterial designs. And by the time that my kids are old enough, to go to university, they'll be doing this work every day. Because it's only 4.5 million bits to make E. coli. And when things get faster, better, cheaper, it'll cost a few dollars to synthesize a bacterial genome. Scientists today are on the cusp of synthesizing the yeast. Well, they've synthesized the yeast genome. They're literally debugging this bug. It's a single-celled organism. Yeast is what we use for making bread and beer. I love it. But it's about 1 billion years more evolved than E. coli. It's closer to you and me. So we're learning a ton of genome engineering technologies from this work, and it's nearing the end. It's been a lot longer than they thought. And this kind of summarizes where we go from here. It's taken 20 years to build the foundational synthetic technologies to start building proteins and start building circuits and start building the simplest organisms. And now we're starting to move into megabase size synthetic DNA constructs. That's whole chromosomes. The smallest human chromosome is 50 million base pairs. We're going to be synthesizing human chromosomes and mouse chromosomes and plant chromosomes very shortly. And after that, I don't know where it goes. I just know it changes the world because now it's our intention that's going to drive evolution. We're already using these tools of editing and synthesis in conservation, trying to protect some of the organisms that we nearly destroyed, and we're even de-extincting some of the more recently lost organisms because DNA is a really tough molecule and can last unprotected for millions of years. So we can recover these genomes and resynthesize them. And of course, we're going to use them on ourselves. There's already been reports of the first gene-edited babies in China, unconfirmed scientifically because they're not exactly transparent. But believe me, it's not that hard to engineer anything in human chromosomes either. Writing a human genome or parts thereof will give us not just the technology to diagnose every disease, that's what sequencing gave us and other technologies. It'll give us the ability to cure any genetic disease. It'll give us the ability to enhance, and maybe that's not what you want, but you can bet there's people out there that want to do that. So I think it's naive to not think these are going to be applied to us as well, and fairly soon. And that's not the end. It's going to keep going. It's literally there's no species barrier in genomics. We can mix and match across every living organism. So we're going to make organisms that nature couldn't. I don't know what those will be. We'll be shocked and surprised. There's a giant economic driver for this. This paper was published a few years ago by a group that was funding synthetic biology companies. And they said, look, the global economy is about $100 trillion, and it doubles about every 25 years. But a lot of these industries are already maxing out the capacity of natural resources to sustain them, biology is going to fill that gap. Biology is the most natural of natural resources. I mean, where do you think the oil came from? Today, we don't have to refine the goop. We can just make the stuff that we want, whether it's a polymer, a high-energy molecule, et cetera. So there is a giant economic driver to push these technologies forward. And it's going to happen faster than almost anyone expects because the factories are everywhere. Like the most advanced factories are everywhere. So it's going to be rate limited by our ability to code. And of course, our ability to code today is being accelerated through artificial intelligence and design tools. So really, today, the rate limiting step is how fast we can synthesize DNA. And that's going to improve very quickly. After that, it'll be our ability to test the organisms and designs that we make. So this is a world-changing technology. No exaggeration. This will change the living world that this piece of rock, the third rock that all life that we know of exists on. It's absolutely, fundamentally going to change economies in the same way that digital technologies have changed economies. It's going to need regulation. I have no idea what regulation is going to do because if I look at the digital technologies that we're built on, the regulations came after the technology. It moves so quickly that it surprised everyone. And synthetic biology is going to move even faster. And there are some real risks with this technology because the smallest organisms, these viruses, are the ones that spread the fastest, and they're also the easiest to synthesize. I thought COVID would be the giant wake-up call for getting our shit together, folks. Pardon my language. But it hasn't happened yet. But this field is still in its very earliest days. It's in its absolute infancy. There's only been 3 synthetic cells made to date, a few hundred viral species, a few thousand proteins. There's time to organize. We can look to our experience from computing because there we built those systems without any foreknowledge. We were literally pioneering this space and we were naive and silly. We connected computers without putting in firewalls, immunity. Biology figured all this out ages ago. And this is why our moderator, Jane, and I get along so well, because Wired magazine chronicled the evolution of digital systems. I devoured this magazine every month. And when she started sensing the same processes starting in the early days of computing coming into the biological world, we were completely aligned. And I think we just need to get more and more young people. I'm actually a little sad that this room isn't filled with graduate students, because they're the ones that will be building this technology and driving the very forefront of it. I remember these computer systems appearing. This is when elites, the systems that were built in the 1970s, before 1970s, were only available to large organizations, governments, military, industry. When these devices came around, the holy trinity of personal computing, they started to open up to millions and millions of more people, including me. And it shaped my life. It still does. We worried about the worst case scenarios. We made fantastic movies around it. This, war games, there's been plenty of them. And we've made tons of mistakes with computer systems and still do. But the reality is everyone here has them. It's become a foundational part of our society. They work well enough that we trust them. They run our most crucial systems. So I'm an optimist when it comes to these technologies that we'll figure it out. It's really hard to see and anticipate what's going to happen in synthetic biology. It's really hard. It's just so early. But I truly believe that our experience and the lessons we've learned in digital systems can and should be applied to synthetic biology so we avoid the biggest pitfalls. We know that this needs to be an open and transparent network because, again, it's universal for all life, all humans. We can't have the monopolies. We can't have the lack of access that we sometimes see with other digital technologies. So we need to take the lessons and use that as our starting point for this new foundation. Because our evolution as a species isn't over yet. In fact, it's just starting to get interesting because we finally got the reins. And if we're going to build a new relationship with nature, you can bet that we're going to want dominion over it. It's going to take everyone coming together to figure out what that looks like. Thank you for listening to me. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Sorry for my mom.
No, it's fine. Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew. That was wonderful, as always. You know, Andrew has this sort of under-the-radar kind of approach to this stuff. He looks so innocent and speaks so calmly, but I actually call him the bad boy of science and technology, sort of the evil genius with a giant heart and a lot of soul.
Professional mad scientist.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so from now, I think we will kick it off, and we'll just go straight down the line with your all's comments and remarks on his thoughts.
Well, I think one of the ways you have to look at technology is whether you're an optimist or a pessimist or a pragmatist. And I think we've heard a relatively optimistic view, to say the least. There are people out there who have a very dystopian view of the future. And what I like to think about is a pragmatic view of the future. Because there's always been an arms race between technology. One technology leads to another technology to deal with that technology. When we invented the spear, somebody had to invent the shield. And then we had to invent something stronger to pierce the shield, which led to armor, led to something else, and so on. So we ended up with ballistic missiles, and we now use other missiles to shoot down missiles, and we have a whole lot of detection systems to try and keep on top of it. And the lesson of technology is that it always leads to another technology which may be malevolent, or it may be beneficial, but you're never quite sure which is going to dominate. And so the issue of our time is not that we're in technology development, but we're in very rapid technological development. It's this pace of change, which means that society no longer has a way of thinking about it proactively. And, you know, if you think about the speed with which something can happen, it can have really unintended consequences very quickly. So it took something like 70 years for telephones to get to 15 million people. It took, I think, 17 days, I may have the numbers right, for Pokemon Go to get to the same number of people. But Pokemon Go had unintended consequences. It may have been an amusement, but it led to something which most people in democratic countries thought was a sacred value, sacred space, to be compromised. So people started using Holocaust memorials or museums or even private homes belonging to other people as places of amusement. So values can be compromised very rapidly by rapidly moving technology. So the big issue of our time, and it's a diplomatic issue more than anything else, it's actually a really fundamental diplomatic issue, is how do we get to adaptive differential technological regulation at speed? Because ideally, and there's a very good piece in Foreign Affairs in October, the October issue, ideally you want to regulate technologies to magnify the benefit of the upsides and reduce the risk of the downsides. You will never obviate the risks of the downsides, but you can try and constrain them. I don't think anybody knows how to do it. I really don't. Part of the problem is, of course, the technologies now emerge out of nowhere. Nobody knew about Pokemon Go till it emerged. Technologies are emerging rapidly. Suddenly Craig Venter had produced well, I knew Craig, but I know Craig, but we knew what he was doing, but it suddenly appeared out of nowhere for most people. And as was said, it's not really well known. And the other problem that relates to this is these things cross borders. Viruses, bacteria don't need passports. So the issues of trans-border jurisdictional control are now enormous. And if we just think about the pragmatic reality of the world we're in now, where we have very distinct technopoles emerging between, just in the digital world, between China and America, with Europe trying to be something in the middle, the ideas of getting consistent technological regulation on the digital technology are not there. Now you put on top of that the geostrategic issues of our times, China versus America, now Russia versus the West, the issues of how we get compromised on something rapidly moving as this technology are the diplomatic challenge of our time. I don't know how we will do it, and I'm going to come back to it in a moment. I think when we talk about these technologies, we need to think a lot about language. It's easy to hype up these technologies. It's easy to overstate the downside of these technologies. But what we do need is to be clear about what the public understands by them. And I think we need to realise that science is not what's describing to the ordinary public what the technologies are. It's films, the Terminator, those kinds of films. It's the public media, it's literature that actually give people their perception of emerging technologies. And as President of the International Science Council, I think one of the real challenges is how does science explain these technologies and overcome the prior perceptions that have been built in the popular media? It's not the mainstream technical media it's the popular fictional media, the science fiction and so forth, that are driving perceptions. I think there's a real danger here, and I don't have the solutions, but I think we should know enough from what happened with the internet, where the upside was seen by everybody, so everybody adopted the technologies with nobody thinking about what you could have predicted would happen, that it would have malevolent consequences if there weren't proper ways of using it. And yet, on the other hand, in many countries with GM, which could have done genetic modification, which could do so much for food security and so forth, because the language was used badly, it was reacted against and used by supermarket chains to promote the fact they were GM-free and so forth. There's some real issues here about language. And I think synthetic biology has to think about whether the language it's using is going to be frightening or understanding to people. And I think if it's going to be used wisely, those issues are going to be very real. So I want to come back to the point I'm slightly, perhaps not in order, but I want to come back to the reality of these technologies. The biggest, in 1975, the world signed a convention on biological warfare. At this stage, some 30 years on, we still do not have a convention. Only 50% of countries are reporting against it appropriately. So we do not know where all the synthetic laboratory biology labs are in the world. We do not know, there is no inspection regime, because the only complaints regime is to go to the Security Council, where the 5 players who are likely to be using those technologies and developing those technologies can veto it. There's no technical support system as there is for chemical warfare. So here we are developing a technology that state or non-state actors, and I want to come back to the issue of non-state actors in a moment, could rapidly use in malevolent ways, and we actually don't have a mechanism for the diplomats to manage it. We're relying on self-regulation as we have been over nuclear warfare for a long time. Are we that safe with what's going on in Ukraine just over there at the moment? Or is it that way? I'm lost in direction. But the point is that we are not so sure about self-regulation as we were a year ago. And if we think about non-state actors, in the digital world, we've already seen the power of non-state actors. I'm working with one country that's actually worried about the reality that the loyalty of their citizens will shift from the nation state to a non-state actor. And they're doing a lot of work to think about that. Now, it's not quite the same in this situation, but I think we need to think about these technologies. Finally, I want to come to the pandemic. Sitting somewhere around this town are people negotiating over the pandemic treaty or something like a pandemic treaty. It won't be a treaty. Should that cover not just natural organisms, but also anthropogenic organisms? That's a discussion worth reflecting on. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So I apologize, I didn't tell you who this is. This is, in fact, Peter Gluckman. And our next speaker is Arantxa Gonzalez-Laya. Before you start, I just want to point out that we got a little bit of a late start this evening, and we've all gone a little long, which makes us a little stressed because we want to let there be enough time for conversation, and we want to hear what you have to say. So with my apologies, I'm going to ask you to maybe be a little bit briefer than we had discussed originally, and see if you can get us your major talking points in maybe 5 or 6 minutes.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I was, since I was very little, I was vaccinated against being optimistic or pessimistic. I've always been an activistic. And the activist in me is concerned because what I see in this conversation is a major contradiction. We are breaking the frontiers of science and technology. This is what we saw today. It's amazing. It made me pause. But the real world is erecting barriers, is fragmenting the economy, creating another kind of geopolitical Cold War. So the difficulty we have, and it's a huge difficulty because there is an inherent contradiction in this conversation, is that science is breaking barriers, but geopolitics and the economy is erecting barriers. So whether we take the diffusion of this incredible science, whether we discuss control of this incredible science, whether we discuss ethics, or whether we discuss fairness, a word that we haven't heard, but it's a huge part of this conversation, this contradiction becomes apparent. So we're living in a moment of power competition, and technology and science is power. It's geopolitical power, it's military power. Imagine bio-enhanced soldiers. This is not a dream. That's what we're talking about. And of course, there is a power competition also on the economy. And as we heard, this is a 100 trillion economy. So this is how we have to frame this conversation, because this is the only way we will be able to deal with the contradictions in this conversation. Let's look at the economic bit. It's a huge conversation. It's about health. We know how deep this goes into our societies. It's a conversation about energy, synthetic energy. Can you imagine? We are discussing now decarbonizing. This is a huge economic issue. It's about agriculture. It's about food, therefore. It's about materials. It's about chemicals. It's huge. Now, let's look at how these 3 poles around the world, the poles that are investing heavily in synthetic biology, look at this. China looks at the state, a state pumping money and state controlling the results of the innovations that will be generating with this money. The US looks at business. Companies, private sector, making a lot of returns on these innovations. Europe looks at citizens. It's not very different. This conversation is not very different from the conversation we're having on regulating technology, because the conversation is exactly the same one. So I thought, Jane, that I would throw this as part of starting to unpack. This unpacking, obviously, on the economic side, a big part of this conversation will depend on how fast this scales up, goes from an idea to the market, and obviously how this is diffused. And diffusion will depend on investments, will depend on skills, and depend on a regulatory environment. At the moment, all of this is up for being constructed. So the only thing I would suggest, and I'll end here, Jane, is that we need to create a space for this conversation to take place. This space does not exist. This space needs to be with the scientists at the table, with the business at the table, with the governments at the table, with the all these non-state actors also around the table. But we have to start this conversation because there are huge dimensions that will have huge impact on our economies and on our societies that we cannot just let to, in my view, market forces.
Completely
Back to
agree.
you.
Yeah, completely agree. Thank you, Arantxa. And our last speaker tonight is Timothy Swanson.
Thank you. In the interest of being quick, I will skip talking points altogether and tell a couple of stories. So, because it behooves the last speaker to be interesting as well as quick. So, I will do that. The only talking point I would say is that from the perspective of somebody who's interested in regulations, such as myself, this is a story about an information-based industry, as Andrew said, and it's similar to and parallel to the other information-based industries that we've been seeing over the last 50 years, the digital ones and the life sciences ones. And the futures I don't know so much about, but the past I know more about. And so I can tell you a couple of stories that maybe will let you know what, from a regulator's standpoint, some of the problems that you can probably expect to see here will be, including some of the ones that have already been mentioned. So, very quickly, so after I'd graduated from my graduate program, which happened to be law and economics, and as befits someone who goes to graduate school in the United States, I had to go earn some money and pay some debts. And so the first thing I did was become a lawyer in Seattle. And the first client who walked in was the developer of a campus over in Redmond, Washington. First industrial business campus over in Redmond. And the second person who walked in was the Bill Gates group who came in and said that they would like to get the entire campus. I said, we had Mutual of New York as our finance partner, which is who we are representing, most conservative institution in the whole world, and the last thing they wanted was to hear from a 100-person strong company with $17 million in revenue in 1981 coming in and saying, yes, we don't want the 8 buildings, we want you to build 28. This was beyond belief. It was a nightmare to be trying to negotiate. But the interesting thing about it was that he was right. The interesting thing about it was he had nothing in his pocket. The PC came out in '82. He had nothing in his pocket but a contract with IBM. But out of that contract, and this is the fundamental problem of information-based industries, is that in order to, this is Arrow's fundamental paradox of information, the only way that you can capture the value of information is to attach it to something else, like a patent. You can't get the value of information by selling it because nobody wants to buy it until you tell them, and nobody wants to pay for it once you've told it. So that's the fundamental paradox. Gates knew he was going to take away the IBM monopoly, operating system monopoly with MS-DOS, and he knew he was going to take away the business programming monopoly with Windows and then Word and Excel. So essentially, walking in there in 1982, he already saw it all. And personally, I believe that despite the fact that they brought the Netscape case in the end, he walked away. He could have owned it all. He could have just kept going right through social media and we wouldn't have had to deal with these other clowns. So in any event, but he decided to become the tech champion of the world and foundation manager instead, and walked away and let these others start to run some of these other things. That's the first point. Concentration, he had to have the industry to have the value. And that's so the information was a small part of what he was doing. He was trying to capture the industry. And that's always going to be a problem in this area, is going to be the concentration that results. Second story. So I paid off my debts, walked off, went to Cambridge, became an assistant professor at Cambridge, and started working in the life sciences on various industries in the life sciences. The UK Department of Trade and Industry came in and asked me to look at the green revolution. I'd been working on research and development issues in agriculture. So empirically we looked, and to cut this as short as possible, we took a look at it, and it was really fascinating to me. Who didn't know that much about the Green Revolution? They were just wondering, was this a fair thing or not? It turned out that looking at the top 10 commodity crops, that when you looked across the distribution of yields across the world, that in fact the top seven crops in terms of yield expansion, we're doing what you would expect. The poorest countries were catching up, and it was doing well in general. I'm sorry, the top 7 of the top 10. But the top 2 crops in terms of expansion were maize and sorghum. Maize and sorghum are 2 crops that essentially the information is embedded in the plant. Because of hybrid varieties, you can actually capture the information in the plant. These 2 had the fastest growth at the frontier, but they didn't diffuse. They were the slowest growing, and in fact, the poorest countries in the world were falling further from the technological frontier with every year of the Green Revolution. So you had this amazing paradox, once again, of the private sector finding an area in which they could appropriate the information, making that move at all, but at the same time it compacted the information. And it wouldn't diffuse, and the world had all the problems that we see with orphan diseases and that we see with patent parallel sales and all of these problems. So this is the 2 problems that you really have to deal with, I think, in an information industry, is the tendency and necessary tendency to concentrate, and the necessarily problematic case of trying to keep diffusion of the technologies moving.
All right, excellent, thank you for that. Okay, so I want to encourage anyone to speak up who has a comment on whatever the topic might be, as I want to encourage anyone from the audience or online to go ahead and throw us your questions to make this as interactive as possible. So I have some ideas here too, but I'm very curious what you guys think, because you've been listening very attentively and patiently. But Peter, it looked like you were going to say something.
I was only going to emphasize what's already been said, that in general, recent technological developments are actually exacerbating inequalities rather than reducing inequalities. We're seeing that both within countries and beyond countries. So we've seen that in the effective digital divide that happened during pandemics with lockdowns, that people who didn't have access to digital technologies are far worse off as a result than those who did have, particularly young people. And I think if we look around the world, these kind of technologies, particularly the ones that have been talked about tonight, are more likely to enhance those who have access to the information, as you've said, and relative to those who don't. So I think there's all sorts of moral and ethical and diplomatic issues in these very rapidly non-diffusing technologies.
Absolutely true. So we've heard a lot about comparisons to the computing digital revolution, the rise of the internet, and so forth. What are the key lessons that we can take away from what we did right and what we did wrong in terms of regulating that? Somebody said earlier that there was no pushback against this. As the founder of Wired magazine, I felt a lot of pushback I heard a lot of, particularly the media, saying, the internet is nothing but a threat, or at the very least, a menace. It was going to exacerbate the digital divide. There'd be the haves and have-nots. I mean, I think they predicted a lot of this stuff, but the reason we didn't immediately jump on the regulation is because we very effectively made the case that the regulators didn't know how to regulate something that was moving so quickly. So what's going to be different this time?
Well, I mean, they didn't know, they didn't want to know, because the argument was being put forward that there's innovation is economic growth. Economic growth is number one and has been in the last 30 years in the neoliberal economies. So they didn't really want to know. I spent years discussing with successive prime ministers the issues of needing to, and Andy's in the audience, we've talked to Andy Wickloff, we've talked a lot about the issues of digital regulation, AI regulation and so forth. The reality is, A, it happens too fast. B, it's coming out of the private sector without a lot of, and governments don't want to stifle regulation for economic growth. The downsides come later, and by which time, you could argue that the authors got it right in the 1930s. Aldous Huxley said the Brave New World was about a few powerful technocrats and everybody else drugged with happiness. George Orwell had a different view of it, which may be reflective in some countries to the east of here. But I mean, the point is that there's always going to be a tension between what governments want and thinking ahead in rapidly moving technologies. Andy may want to comment because he doesn't. But I think this is the fundamental issue, that the drivers of a short-term government versus the drivers of companies versus what is good for society don't have the same time basis.
So time is one element. One of the things that I'm thinking about is accessibility, and people involved in the effort to sequence the human genome ended up collecting a lot of data that is not a reflection of humanity, because they were able to collect it mostly from white people of European descent. That is clearly not a way forward, not because of it's not driven as much by ethical concerns as it is by the fact that it will no longer be representative of the human race. So if we collect data on the human immunome or whatever else we need to do, that project has shown us that we cannot move forward if we do not understand the incredible heterogeneity of our population. And so I would say that perhaps sequencing the genome is one thing that has opened our eyes. And just from the scientist's point of view, it's just not helpful to only have data from white Europeans. It doesn't show us the whole picture. It doesn't help us manage a pandemic. So things have changed.
You see, this is it's a discussion that we've seen over and over again. Every time there's been a new area, we've always gone through, well, if we regulate, we stifle innovation. That's step one. Then we realize that something happens that requires regulation, and then we go to fragmented regulation, with governments doing it. And then after we fragmented the level playing field, we go to the third stage, which in my view should be the first stage. You need to build the spaces where public and private sit to discuss boundaries. Boundaries. Let's not call this regulation, because that's really stale talk. But what are the boundaries? Let's take technology. It's only when we realized that technology had a huge impact on democracy, we started to take seriously building the boundaries. It's only when we realized that it had huge impact on concentration of wealth that we started talking of boundaries. So one thing we've learned, in my view, from the last wave of this debate that was around tech, is build the spaces for discussing boundaries early enough. Maybe you don't regulate in the sense of building a treaty, like Peter was saying we're trying to deal with pandemics. But maybe we start by building guidelines that will help in every constituency how to manage, how to leverage, how to limit in order to get the benefits without getting too much of the downsides.
So because we're here in the Institute of Graphic Studies, I'll come to you, just let me ask this one first. Let's talk about, Arantxa, you were the one who mentioned the Cold War, the bio-Cold War between China and the United States. I published a story about this about 4 or 5 months ago in Neolife, and had a hard time finding scientific and policy experts who would say, yes, there is a bio-Cold War going on. They were all saying, no, not yet, it's not happening. But in fact, just this week, actually, Britain's spy chief called out China's technology as, a major threat, saying literally these problems with Russia are manageable by comparison. We're seeing a lot of effort by the Biden administration, both in terms of promoting the bioeconomy and also in terms of preventing Chinese companies from investing in the US bioeconomy to kind of push back. There's not a lot of teeth yet in any of this, but I'm curious what the whole panel thinks about, are we already in a bio-Cold War with China? And is it a bipolar, a tripolar? Are you also in are Europeans in a bio-Cold War with America? I don't know.
I think we have to be careful. I don't think we are yet in a Cold War, but we can sleepwalk into that. And we've got two choices, basically. We certainly are in a world of power competition. That's for sure the case. So how do we deal with this power competition? And this is where we have a bifurcated response. So we can take a path that leads to fragmentation, Cold War, you will not access my market, you will not access my technology, you will not access my investments, you will not access my patents, and we will build a two system, well, maybe a 2.5, maybe a 3, don't know. For now, with the investments that are being made, at least in this space, on synthetic biology, it pretty much looks like a two-world, because the third one is too fragmented to be one alternative to the two. But there is another path we can take, which is engaging in a conversation on this topic. But we're not doing it. So I'm going to be the one here, call me naive. They call me naive all the time. I used to live in the city before, and this is the city that embodies precisely building spaces where you discuss, even with your enemy. You have to discuss certain things with your enemy, otherwise there's not going to be a wall big enough to protect you. So I'm going to be the naive in the panel and say, we need to build the spaces where we debate, we discuss, we collaborate.
All technologies can be used in a negative way. That's the reality. And we focused on the concept of hybrid technologies around the military-industrial technologies of the 1980s and all the export bans and everything else. The reality is all these technologies can be a hybrid threat. The issues, therefore, are how does you come to the issues which I think are deeper here, and you've just mentioned them, how do we actually stop the competition which is inevitably there between different players, be them geographical or corporate in nature, from undermining the fundamental things that make us human. I work in a different area. I work largely around the issues of the digital technologies affecting our social being. At what point will we stop being social animals, because we evolved to be social animals with interpersonal connections? At what point will they totally disappear into a metaverse, etc., etc.? These are not unrealistic questions. The same question will be asked about this technology. At what time, at what point in the future will we stop being human and we're another species or something else? These are the issues that are very philosophical, but these technologies, both digital and life sciences and the interaction, as we've talked about, are moving so fast that it becomes a real serious existential question in its own right for our species, not just by blowing ourselves up with a nuclear or with a virus, but at what point do we stop being human?
Big question. Timothy, did you have anything to say on the topic of the bio-Cold War?
Well, I was thinking here that when I don't know that much about the futures. I know Andrew's book with Amy Webb. That's the extent of my knowledge of the biological future. So, but I can't help but think, how is it that for 100 years the international agricultural community cooperated? And it was mainly through departments that talked to one another. There would have been competition, of course, but it wasn't ever spoken to, we're going to try to cause a famine in the Netherlands. It was, and there was an attempt to develop the IARCs, International Research Centers, and it was a tremendous, it was seen as obvious and straightforward that you developed a network. An international network to work together, which has been under assault now for 20 years by the private sector. So it's not the economist's job to point out, the importance of the public sector. So I won't go there. But the bigger problem, I don't know, is not so much at the technological frontier, but not to belabor a point, but is really the fact that Moderna, sent 30 million vaccines to the UK when South Africa had 30,000. So there's the war, and that's a diffusion point again, and that's, I think, still where things should be focused.
Great, thank you for that. Yes, models of success that we could look to, I think, are very useful in this conversation. Sir, you had a comment. Do we have she's coming with a microphone.
Thank you for the presentation and the exchange. I just had maybe a general comment. I mean, synthetic biology, the way it is stated, it's pretty big, vague, and broad topic. And I was wondering if just for the discussion and to having more, regulatory scope, it would be possible maybe to classify it or to make it more specific in what we considered, because from what I've learned tonight, it has implications in microprocessors, it can be used in fuel, it can be used for human augmentation. So just for the applications, then we'll have by default, so we can already have a feeling that some of them will be positive, some of them will be threatening. So wouldn't it make it easier for the debate, like instead of going with just the name without a specification, trying to focus on the aspect or that maybe we want or we don't want or in one field or one industry, and then start to classify it? Because I have the feeling a little bit that when we discuss, everybody has something in mind, an application in mind that is threatening or not, and then the discussion is a little bit abstract. And I'm facing this challenge in my everyday job, so that's why I'm just trying to understand if there is a reason why we are keeping the discussion at the highest possible level, like trend, and not going into more specific area of use.
We've got one precedent in this, and if you think about genetic modification, there are some countries that have banned the use of it altogether. New Zealand is an example of one which will not allow the technology, any genetic modification, out of the laboratory into field trials of crops or anything else. And yet there are other countries which have said, no, the technology is not what's regulated, it's the use of the technology. So a new crop, a particular variant may be approved or not regulated. And the reason that's occurred is not scientific, it's philosophical. There were arguments made in much of Europe and in New Zealand that were philosophically opposed to interfering with the gene line of the plants in this case. And there was many reasons why that happened. It was not only philosophical, there were marketing arguments put forward as well. In other countries, that philosophical debate never won. And so, this has happened before, and I suspect it will happen again here, that gene editing, synthetic biology, they're all effectively cousins of the same fundamental technologies. They will be regulated differently according to social license, philosophical approaches in different countries. And I think that's why I mentioned language, because I think language is going to have an awful lot to do with how different societies think about these technologies.
I would just like to add on to that as well. The United States Food and Drug Administration have ruled that it is not the process of how you achieve something, it's the genetic result, it's the product itself that matters, essentially opening the door to any kind of DNA manipulation that makes it biologically similar to the existing tomato. That strikes me as something that would take a very cold day in hell to happen in Europe. So you're right, it is social, it is cultural, and it is also without boundaries, right? Because tomatoes, can move freely. Oh, do you think it should be geographically diversified before? Okay. Jerome, you're up.
Yes, thank you. I have a question from Nishan Sharma online, who's asking the following question. What would you say to people from the Global South about respecting boundaries discussed and created without their participation in the science to this point? I would suggest that this panel, for example, is quite homogeneous.
Well, we have Europe, America, and New Zealand, Asia represented here, yes, but it's a lot of white people. And let's face it, we're all highly educated elites, so there's that. But Pamela?
No, I think she's got a point. I mean, we've got a partial diversity because we come from different geographies, but also because we come from different backgrounds. We've got scientists, we've got diplomats like me. I have nothing to do with science, so I don't look at it as a scientist. You've got an economist, so, but it's true that there is no southern view in here. That is why I said fairness and building spaces where this diversity is put together is important, because for the legitimacy of the end result, those who sit at the table would be essential.
Okay, great.
I'll go.
We have another question.
You got
here.
another one? I'll go take turns. We're going to ping pong. Come on, here we go. Let's do it that way. You mind, Jane? Hi, Andrew. Good to see you again. So, my job as a futurist and a sort of strategic foresight is to think about the future. And one of my colleagues once said to me, my job for his country is to have nightmares so his citizens don't. Which I really found quite attractive. And as you were going through this, my mind was going on various voyages which started kind of giving me nightmares sitting right here. Thinking to myself, as you said, a 7-year-old could now create chromosomes or create viruses. That kind of scared me a little bit. I'm thinking about rational thought. And a 7-year-old teenager, going back to when my father refused to let me out of the house wearing a jeans with a single hole in it, how angry I was. I would have done anything to him. And I was 15, right? So I wasn't 7, so I might have been able to do something else. But where do we go with that? I mean, we're talking here, but GESDA is about anticipating both the positive, the beautiful things, and also thinking about some of the horrible things that could happen. Geopolitical, economic frontiers, to me this is a frontier which we seem to be glossing over, sort of sliding over, that pretty soon 2 people could make a whole lot of people redundant. Comment.
I am classified as a futurist, and it's because I can't change the past, so I don't worry about it. And there's people that specialize in taking the lessons from the past and moving them forward. I'm not one of those. I just know what I've lived. And I know that, and I see it now, I have 2 children, 7 and 4. They are an alien species today because they grow up in a digital world. My daughter, who is 7 and is my example because I teach her these technologies, one has a better sense of, she's better sense of humanity than I think than many of the humans I deal with. Like, she doesn't want to see the world destroyed. She wants to see every animal saved. She knows that we have to clean up after ourselves. And she knows that these are the technologies that'll do it. They learn how to program computers when they're 5. Like, it's drag and drop today. And so I know that she and her friends and teachers are going to build a new generation of engineers and scientists that will manifest whatever we decide that we're creating here, that we're discussing here. This is, if I took one lesson from computing system, and the growth of the internet, it's whatever can happen will happen. We can't be naive about that. Most of the applications will be positive. Most of them will go into industries that have some regulation. The people doing it will be identifiable, and if something goes wrong, we'll throw the book at them. But there will always be an undercurrent. There will be a darker side, a group that hacks, that gets around rules and systems. And the scary thing for me is these technologies can produce self-manufacturing agents that seriously could harm crops, could harm people, could destroy even our minds. Imagine Alzheimer's weaponized. Like, it doesn't have to be death. It can simply be disabling. And pardon me, but most scientists are not particularly creative on the dark sides. They've never been trained for it. Hollywood producers are great at identifying the dark sides, because that's why we go in the cinemas and read stories. If everything was just, he got cancer and he was fine next week, it's boring. But we need to figure out these technologies. We have to be prepared for the unexpected. We have to have transparency in our ability to find out who did what and where things went wrong. And it has to, I believe that the systems of regulation and discussion need to be digital, because it have to be ongoing, 24/7, watching all the time. But that's why I think we have to take the best and of good and bad from what we learned with the digital technologies and use that as our starting point moving forward.
Okay, how many questions do we have left? We've got about 10 minutes. So, I heard, yes, thank you.
It's a fascinating conversation, thank you very much. So we're seeing where the technology is taking us, or trying to anticipate where the technology is taking us, and we are living this very fragmented context in which there is deglobalization and multipolar positions, and Arantxa just mentioned that we need to create the spaces to create global governance. But how do we create those spaces? Who do we invite? Who invites who? Because I think that this concern over global governance and including everyone, youth, all geographies, all backgrounds, all perspectives is super important. But we seem to miss, the next step, I would say. Who invites who sits at the table, who takes the lead? Where do we create these spaces?
I think there's some historical examples, and they're not perfect. But if you think of the 1970s and 80s, in the middle of the Cold War, scientists, using track 2 approaches, managed to do a number of things that really worked. So the International Geophysical Year of 1957 led 2 years later to the greatest success of science diplomacy, the Antarctic Treaty. If you think, which is dedicate the continent to scientific and peaceful purposes. It's basically science and a little bit of tourism. 1985, the scientists, led by my organisation, had a conference which said the multilateral system needed to do something about climate change. 2 years later, that led to the IPCC. There's 13 years after, I'm blocking on their names, I'm sorry, the scientists who discovered the effects of the ozone and the CFCs. 13 years later, we had the Montreal Treaty. And all of that came through track 2 diplomacy, where it was not formal, there was informal spaces, in this case all driven by science, but I'm not arguing the science is the only place to start it, but I think given that the technologies are science-based, I think there's a place for track 2 diplomacy. It's interesting, and it may be a diversion, but we've just had, in February this year, of course, we had a conflict breakout. International Science Council was faced with people saying, are we going to expel the Russians from the Russian Academy from the International Science Council? The response was no. And when we consulted with a large number of foreign ministries around the world after that, they said, thank you, you didn't do that, because track 2 diplomacy is going to be needed in the inevitable second Cold War. Now, it's not answering your question directly, except to say, I think if we look for the formal diplomatic processes, we may wait a long time because of the geographical issues. I think in this case, track 2 diplomacy coming from International Science Council, along with other partners, may be the only way to get, and it may not be us, it may be other who initiate it, but I think it's the track 2 approaches that will lead to a safe space.
Let me add to this, that in my view, governance these days is a much less Cartesian exercise. So it's not so much as we used to know it, it's much more amorphous, because the world we have to deal with is amorphous. Let me give you an example of a very interesting governance innovation that happened last week. So 4 months ago, the President of France, President Macron, said we need a European political community. So what's a European political community? He said, well, we need to redefine basically the geopolitical Europe, okay? And then the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, said, yeah, we need not a political community, we need a European geopolitical community. So what's that? Well, but guess what? Someone convened a meeting, 44 heads of state and government got to that meeting last week in Prague. Who convened it? The guy that owned the chateau where the meeting took place, the Czech presidency. He served the food, he put the mics, he organized 3 roundtables, one on energy and the economy, one on this and that. And guess what? Out of that there was a photo. A photo. And this photo is today a European political community. This is not a small thing. It's not governance Cartesian way, it's governance 21st century. So whomever has a capacity to convene today starts this conversation, people will go to that table, provided he makes sure that key actors that need to be at that table will be at that table.
Jean-Marie Guéhenno from Columbia University. Yes, working. Now, what you're describing is an enormous expansion of human choices, and therefore of the power of those who will make those choices. States, corporations, and I would add scientists, because not everybody understands and will understand what you're describing. I don't fully understand it, for sure. And so my question is, we have devised over the last 2 or 3 centuries mechanisms of accountability for the citizens, but are these mechanisms fit for purpose now? Because in all due respect to the average parliamentarian and who will really be in a position to make those choices? How do you balance the role of expertise and our idea of democracy in this new world that you're describing?
Okay, this is one of my favorite talking points, to be honest with you, because the scientists themselves do not agree on the best way forward. They do in some circumstances. They came together in the 70s at Asilomar to agree that the recombinant DNA was a scary thing we didn't know enough about. We should probably not proceed without extreme caution. They come together to collaborate in protecting the world from nuclear disaster, et cetera. But the U.S. Congress was completely incapable of understanding Facebook's business model. It wasn't the technology and it wasn't the science, it was the inherent business model that they couldn't wrap their heads around. So I look to China as a country ruled by technocrats, ruled by engineers. The vast majority of the national politicians in China have engineering degrees, and I think that puts them at a tremendous advantage when it comes to regulating this stuff. So that's one thing. On the other hand, there's a scientist named Kevin Esvelt who's working on really alarming and powerful technologies called gene drives. And he went into 2 liberal New England communities and explained the technology and said, we have an immense opportunity here, but you guys drive. You decide every step of the way whether this experiment goes forward or not. And the townspeople showed up for a town's hall and they got the training and the information, and so far they're continuing to give the green light to the next step. But it is an engaging process. It requires enormous amounts of transparency and terrific risk on the part of the scientist or the company or whatever the initiative is. But I do think there are some interesting examples. They're few and far between. But if anyone can convene these conversations that includes people who understand the technology but also can address equality issues and fairness issues and distribution, it would be GESDA.
These are the new modalities of participatory and deliberative democracy. And there's a lot of experiments going on around the world in them. The issue fundamentally is democracy works, and Philip Kitcher, the philosopher, pointed out that so well, when everybody has equal information, and it's it's honest information. I don't want to use the word truth because it's a dangerous word. But that can work at the level of local. The new experiments in local democracy demonstrate that works very well. The difficulty is at large-scale democracies, we're dealing with manipulated information and targeted information. So Kitcher invented the word vulgar democracy to say, is this really a democracy anymore when actors can manipulate the information of most people participating? So we're going to need new models of democracy, and I think these local models are showing what can be done. You could argue Switzerland's had that in a different sense for a long, long time, but the models of democracy that we have inherited, and it's a young experiment democracy, let's be honest, it's only 200 years old, require us to think in an information age of new ways of actually engaging citizens in decisions.
So I think we have to rethink accountability. So is this input, is it output, is it process? We need much greater transparency, and we need a better interface between the science and the legislator. And if you look at what the European Commission has just done, Digital Market Act and the Digital Services Act, you will see a little bit of this already there. We have to reinvent accountability. It's no longer, how many barrels of powder do you have in your, how many stocks do you have of biohazard products. We have to think of something different. It's much more complex, but for sure there is one thing we cannot say, which is, let the guys that are on the science side decide what they have to do. This is what we did with technology. We let the techie guys, we said, okay, it's too complicated, we don't understand the business model. Actually, the business model was pretty clear. The business model of a lot of these technologies was very clear, but we let them deal with it. And in today's 21st century, in societies that are democratic, you cannot just simply let the scientist, whether they be on the technology side or whether it be on the synthetic biology, in my view, we need an interface that is going to be capable of decoding this for the legislator, because otherwise there is no control. And the last thing you want in a democratic society is to have no one controlling.
All right, so that takes us to, sadly, the last of our comments that we can take tonight. But I just think this was an amazing conversation. We heard about the importance of a place to have these conversations, of a place that includes people, that is transparent. We heard that this is about power, and it's about fairness. We heard it's also about safety and opportunity. And so language matters, and cultural products have a huge, enormous impact on non-technical communities. So I loved your example of the photo. The photo, the language, the cultural signals are very important. And there are examples to consider, both positive and negative. And so I think those are all, I think, rather encouraging takeaways from a conversation that I thought was going to be far more depressing than it actually was. So I thank the panelists for your participation, Andrew for your inspiration, and all of you for coming and your fantastic questions.